I am Clark Taylor, the founder and chair of the Needham Area Immigration Justice Task Force. And some of our members are here, and happy to meet the rest of you. Back in January, I think it was, Phyllis Mays said that she would be happy to have her daughter, who is here, speak to us and get her name and a little bit about her. And truth to tell, we were just still a bit wondering, and then when we started to have her story unfold, we were very, very pleasantly impressed that she would be here speaking. And so, without further ado, I'm just going to be welcoming you here on behalf of the Needham Area Immigration Justice Task Force. And now I'm going to pass the microphone to Amelia Klein, who is the co-chair of the Needham Human Rights Committee that's co-sponsoring this event here tonight. And she will welcome us on behalf of that group, the Needham Human Rights Committee.
I'm Amelia Klein. I'm co-chair of the Needham Human Rights Committee along with Marlene Schultz. A year ago, the Human Rights Watch released its annual report on the state of human rights around the world. In addition to highly critical reports on Syria, the Central African Republic, and other countries with repressive regimes or violence conflicts, the New York-based advocacy group highlighted a particular issue in the United States: the abuse of immigrants, especially illegal immigrants, under current U.S. policies and conditions. The organization One America has stated that non-citizens face significant exposure to human rights abuses because they are often removed from their communities and support networks. Immigrant women and children are even more vulnerable, often being denied access to health care and education, exposed to abuse of various kinds, and subjected to trafficking and arbitrary detention and deportation. On behalf of the Needham Human Rights Committee, I welcome you to this event and hope that after Maragret Stock's presentation, you will leave this room with a clear understanding that discrimination and abuse based on immigration status are violations of human rights.
Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Gerald Rovner, who is himself an immigration lawyer. And while some of the rest of us didn't know exactly who you were, Margaret, he knew. And so it seems logical that he should be the one to introduce you for us here tonight.
Thank you very much. Good evening. My name is Jerry Rovner, and I really have the privilege and honor of introducing our guest speaker this evening. But first, I wanted to thank the Needham Public Schools for allowing us to use this auditorium, and both the Needham Human Rights Commission and the Needham Area Immigration Task Force for co-sponsoring tonight's meeting. I won't ask you to turn off your mobile devices because I know you've already done that. To set the stage, I have a little story to tell you. A fellow was walking along the beach one day and came across an urn. It looked like the classic shape. You know, the one that when you rub it, a genie pops out, and sure enough, he rubbed it, a genie popped out. Genie said, "You have 3 wishes. What would you like?" The first one was, "I would like to be wealthy." He said, "No problem." Then the fellow pulled out a map of the Middle East, showed it to the genie, and said, "Could you do something to cure the warring nations around here so that there'll be everlasting peace among these nations?" Genie looked at it, furrowed his brow, studied the map, crinkled his eyes, and said, "Well, that might be a little tougher. What's your third vote? Your third wish?" The boy said, "Well, could you explain to me what the Congress is going to do with the immigration laws of the United States?" Genie's mouth dropped open, just as you chuckled. He thought for a moment, reached over for the map, and said, "Let me see that map again." Story may sound apocryphal, but what Congress will do with the immigration laws of the United States does take a genius to explain. And fortunately, our guest speaker is just that person to do so. Lieutenant Colonel Maragret Stock is a winner of the 2013 prestigious MacArthur Foundation Genius Award. She'll speak to us about the future of immigration reform in the United States. To those of us that practice immigration law, we know her as a nationally known expert on immigration and national security law. She has testified regularly before the congressional committees on immigration, homeland security, and military matters. Prior to her retirement from the military, she had been a member of the faculty at the United States Military Academy at West Point and had served in various postings in the military police. Margaret has served as a member of the American Bar Association Commission on Immigration from 2008 to 2012. She regularly authors articles on military-related immigration issues and recently published the second edition of her very well-received volume from the American Immigration Lawyers Association. The MacArthur Foundation, in presenting her with the Genius Award, cited her from among her many achievements for her groundbreaking work developing programs to better the lives of both native-born and immigrant members of the military. It is a distinct honor and great privilege that I present to you Maragret Stock.
It's really wonderful to be here, and I thank you for that terrific introduction. And of course, I also have to thank my mother, because she's the one who told me there would be 5 or 6 of her friends here tonight. I wanted to talk about immigration, and I could maybe score a free bottle of water, you know, if I came on. But I'm from Anchorage, Alaska, and I usually start these talks by telling people that, yes, I can see Russians from my house. In fact, we have a very nice Russian family. They came as refugees long ago. They're speaking English fluently now, and I get to say "Здравствуйте" to them when I'm on the way to the mailbox. But seriously, there's a little known piece of American immigration history that I often tell audiences, because most people outside Alaska don't know this piece of American immigration history, and neither do most Alaskans. It's a deep, dark secret, but Alaska appears to be the only state that has ever had an undocumented immigrant as its governor. And it was not Sarah Palin. As far as I can tell, she was born in Idaho, and she is a 14th Amendment birthright citizen of the United States, if you're familiar with the citizenship debate. Now, it was somebody named John Franklin Strong, and he was the territorial governor of Alaska in the early 1900s, and the folks in Washington made him our territorial governor without checking his papers. He was outed when his other wife showed up from Canada looking for him. He told people in the news media at the time that he had trouble getting a divorce from his first wife, and that's why he had 2 wives. But he then ran off, and we got a new governor. So there's a little bit of immigration history for you. My slide person here. Good job. Okay, well, I usually start these talks also by telling people a little bit about the MacArthur Foundation. It's a wonderful recognition when you get the phone call from them. This is a fellowship you cannot apply for, and they won't tell you who nominated you for it. They just call you on the phone one day and they say, you are a MacArthur Fellow, and you think it's one of your friends playing a joke on you, but it turns out it's not. And it was interesting to me because they recognized 3 things, all of which involved immigration reform, and all of which were accomplished without Congress. They were all executive action, interestingly. So one program had to do with providing free immigration lawyers to people serving in the military. And it was a program that was developed through the American Immigration Lawyers Association. It's called today the ALA-MAP program, American Immigration Lawyers Association Military Assistance Program. And I thought it was kind of a little bit ironic that the MacArthur Foundation was recognizing me for this, because I came up with this program in order to get work off my desk. And of course, you know, to get work off your desk, you get other people to volunteer to handle the work. So ALA-MAP is a program where ALA lawyers volunteer to help military members, veterans, and their families with immigration work on a pro bono basis. And since there are some lawyers in the room who will volunteer to help out with this program, it's a terrific program. It's helped literally thousands of military families to date, and other folks related to the military with their immigration issues. And then the second thing that the MacArthur folks cited was something called Basic Training Naturalization, which is a program I didn't think of. Historically, it was something the United States did up until the end of the Vietnam War, we used to naturalize all of our military members at basic training. So at the end of basic training from the military, they would graduate with American citizenship before being deployed overseas. And they stopped doing this at the end of the Vietnam War, and it led to a lot of bad stories, including one soldier getting tragically killed on the way to get his fingerprints taken in Iraq for his citizenship application, because they were trying to naturalize people overseas, and it was difficult and complicated, and you had to get your fingerprints done, and he was traveling in a convoy in Iraq, and tragically was killed on the way to getting the fingerprints done so he could get his citizenship. So to stop that sort of thing, we put something called basic training naturalization in place, purely by executive action, and there was no outcry from anyone about this. People thought it was a wonderful thing and applauded the initiative. And then the last thing I did, which I'd be happy to answer questions, but I'm not going to cover it in my presentation, is the program called Military Accessions Vital to the National Interest, which allows people who are certain high-skilled professionals to join the military today, even though they're not citizens and they don't have green cards, and they become American citizens at basic training, and they go on to serve our military. And the program is called MAVNI by the acronym Military Accessions Vital to the National Interest, but it produced the 2012 U.S. Army Soldier of the Year was a MAVNI, and it produced a number of soldiers who deserve recognition, including an individual from MIT who had 2 master's degrees from MIT, and he quit his PhD program at MIT to join the Army, got his citizenship about 10 weeks later, and is planning eventually, after he finishes his service in the Army, to return to MIT and get a PhD. So I'd be happy to answer questions at the Q&A about that as well. But I do like to tell people a little bit about the mysterious MacArthur Foundation, because I generally get some questions about it, so I thought I'd get that out of the way right this time. You want to know, though, about the future of immigration reform. And of course, nobody can predict the future, but I do want to tell you some of the trends that I see. And I also want to give you kind of the big picture of what's going on out there, because I have this feeling that immigration law has become so difficult and complicated that most people don't really understand what's happening, and all you hear are sound bites. So we're going to try to get beyond the sound bites and kind of look at the big picture of what's happening. And I'll start that with the next slide, which is a famous quote from Aristotle. I think those of you who've seen the movie Legally Blonde, a famous top 10 legal movie, you might remember there's this opening scene with the professor from Harvard Law School, and she has a student bet on who said that famous saying, law is reason free from passion. And she has him bet his fellow student's life on the fact that Aristotle said that. And apparently Aristotle did say that, except in Greek, of course. Law is reason free from passion. This is a classical saying that lawyers really believe in, that this is the point of law. It's supposed to be logical rules that make sense. And it's not supposed to be emotion and passion. It's supposed to be deliberative and thoughtful. And you can go look up the law and understand it, and it's supposed to make sense. Now, the first thing I want to tell you tonight is that immigration law is the opposite. Immigration law is passion free from reason. Okay, so keep that in mind. Next slide. Now, I also want to remind you, because I know I'm in Needham, which is a very old town. How long has Needham been around, Mom?
1713.
Okay, before we were founded as a country, and I always like to return people to the founding documents. So here we have a picture, an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence. And people go, well, what does that have anything to do with immigration? It has a huge amount to do with immigration. If you go read the Declaration, one of our grievances against King George was immigration. And the fact that King George was limiting immigration. And you can read it up there. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither. So our founders put that in writing, that one of their big grievances was they wanted more immigration, and they wanted people to become citizens. And the King of England was preventing that, and they had a revolution to overthrow him in order to stop him from doing those sorts of things. So a lot of people have forgotten that, and I wanted to start with that. Next. Today, however, we've come a long way from the founders, and we now have this view that we are the nation of immigrants. We believe that our nation was founded on principles of open immigration, essentially. And these are epitomized by this famous poem from Emma Lazarus. How many people in the audience had to memorize this? All right, a bunch of you, so you can recite this. Give me your tired, your poor, your old message yearning to breathe free. This is what we believe is our national view of immigration, that we are a haven for refugees. The unfortunate reality today is that this is a myth. America today does not welcome the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. As you indicated in your opening remarks, we actually lock up the tired masses in detention centers out in the desert, and we try to deprive them of lawyers and send them back as soon as possible to send a message to deter them from coming to America. Because today, based on 200 years of immigration law history, we actually don't want anybody who's tired or poor or huddled or yearning to breathe free. Our immigration laws today mainly welcome people who are, let's say, of higher socioeconomic status. People who have money, people who can hire lawyers, people who are married to middle-class or higher Americans who can afford to sign the affidavit of support to sponsor them to come to the United States. If you're poor, your relatives are poor, you're not welcome under our immigration laws, with the exception of the very small quota of refugees that we take every year. And the president sets the quota, but for a country of 320 million people, the most we ever take typically in a year is about 100,000 people. So that's a drop in the bucket for 320 million people, 100,000 refugees taken every year. Okay. So this is our national myth, I say. It's not really true. The reality is a little different. This is more of our reality. We have somewhere today between 8 and 20 million people who are not supposed to be here, according to the government. We don't know exactly how many because the government's not very good at counting them. If you look at different studies, some people say it's 8 million, some people say it's 20 million. That came from a Bear Stearns report where they analyzed lots of people who are in the United States. The government says officially it's about 12.5 million people that are in the United States without permission. And these are called by various terms, the unauthorized, some people say illegal, alien, I don't really like that term too much, but the undocumented, 40% of them are people who came legally and overstayed their visas. So they're not supposed to be here, but they came legally. This is a very large number of people. And one of the reasons we have so many of these folks here is because we have huge backlogs and quotas for legal migration. There are some people who today will file a visa petition for a relative, and that relative cannot expect to come to the United States based on current processing for 105 years because of the quotas and the backlogs. And we'll go into that a little bit more later. We have a very heavy burden on citizens and employers. Everybody here in the room is affected by our immigration laws. If you get a job today, the first thing you do when you show up for work on the first day of work is you have to prove that you are authorized to work in the United States. You have to show documents to your employer by law. And you've had to do that since 1986. And that's because your employer has been designated as an agent of the federal government for immigration enforcement. Now, looking back, 1775, the founders would have been appalled by the thought that the federal government could tell people whether they could work or not. That wasn't something that was in their concept, you know, that the federal government had the authority to tell people whether they could work. But that's our reality today. And then the last piece of this, which brings back to the immigration lawyers, is that our immigration laws have become a complete mess. This is best epitomized, though, I think, by an official quote from the Department of Homeland Security official spokesperson, Karen Krausauer. She was saying on the record in the Washington Post that immigration law is a mystery and a mastery of obfuscation. Now, that's a polite way of saying the law is complicated, it makes no sense, the agency doesn't understand it, okay? It's very, very difficult law, and that is an official quote that was on the record, she was saying. Next slide. We have a huge amount of unauthorized immigration, as I mentioned before, and this is just a chart showing how it's tracked over the years, going up to 2008 and going up. And this is because, essentially, unauthorized migration comes for a couple of reasons. One, people want to be with their families. And if they can't get here legally to be with their families, they will figure out a way to get here without permission to be with their families. And secondly, it's jobs. If you live in a country where you can't support your family, and America offers you a job, you're not supposed to be able to work in America, but there are plenty of employers who will employ you, even with the tacit approval of the federal government. And so if you need to survive, you come over because you want to work. And so we see, as the economy improves, the illegal migration gets bigger and bigger. It has today, though, they've announced, leveled off. And this is in large part due to the fact that the economy up until now hasn't been so great. And people have tightened the border, and that's made it harder for people to come over. So we're seeing just as much illegal immigration as we had a few years ago in the sense of people in the country without permission, but fewer crossing unlawfully at the border as of today. They've kind of dried up the entry a little bit. Next slide. And of course, there's a big controversy going on today all over the country and here in Massachusetts as well about young people who were brought to the United States when they were very young, who've grown up here and who cannot be distinguished from every other young American living in America today, except for the fact that when they turn 18, they can't vote, they can't work legally, they have no way to get papers to live in the United States. They can go to college and university, and in some states it's a little bit easier to do that than in others, but their future is bleak because they have no immigration status. And we're a nation today that has a lot to do with showing papers as a means to success in the world of employment. We call these folks, of course, the Dreamers, and that's for the Developmental Relief and Education Act for Alien Minors, but it's easier to remember Dreamers, and so that's what we call them today. Next slide. The best metaphor for the mess that we're in right now, I think, came from future Republican presidential candidate Jeb Bush. He actually wrote a book that I urge you to read if you're interested in these issues called Immigration Wars. And he lays out the fact that our immigration system is a leaky dam. It's his metaphor, and I think it's a good one. A dam is supposed to power a nation's economy, right? It's supposed to provide power, electricity, good things, provide good things. That's the purpose of a dam. Our immigration system is supposed to power our economy, give us the workers, the people that we need, the businesses, the investments that we need to make our economy strong. And yet today, largely as a result of Congress, the dam has got all kinds of holes in it. It's leaky, it's a mess. Congress keeps trying to patch it. As soon as they patch one section, a leak springs up somewhere else. And the dam, the immigration system, is no longer providing the power to our economy that we need for a strong future, for a superpower future. We just don't have that anymore. And in large part, it's because of the mess we've made. Jeb Bush, by the way, says that we should tear the entire dam out and build a new one. That's his metaphor. The immigration system is such a mess, he thinks the whole thing should be scrubbed, taken out, and we should start over with a new 21st century immigration system. And I'll talk a little bit later about what that might look like. Next slide. I want to start, though, before getting into the deep discussion, with what I see the public thinks out there. The public believes there's something called the path to citizenship, and it's depicted on the slide. It's a nice, neat path. People start the path as aliens. That's a statutory term. It means you're not a citizen or national of the United States. You're a foreigner, essentially. And you get on this path, and eventually, if you follow the path diligently, and you do what you're supposed to do, eventually you're supposed to become an American citizen. And the majority of the public thinks that there's a path out there, and that you can get on it, and you can become a citizen. Now the idea here depicted here is you're an alien, and you might get a non-immigrant visa of some sort, and then eventually you might get an immigrant visa, and then eventually you're going to become a citizen of the United States. And most people think that you can do this. The reality, and I'm speaking as an immigration lawyer of many years, and Mr. Rogner will confirm this, is that most people in the world can't qualify for anything. They can't qualify for a non-immigrant visa. Even fewer can qualify for an immigrant visa, and even fewer of those who get green cards, the immigrant visa, can qualify for citizenship. So this path is not open to everyone. In fact, it's open to hardly anybody. But there are still some people out there who can get on this path. Is there anybody in the audience who's gotten on a path, gotten a non-immigrant visa, and then gotten a green card? All right, so there's some people out here who've done that. Have you made it to citizen yet?
Not yet.
Not yet? You're on the path, though. All right, congratulations to you. And do I have one citizen, naturalized citizen?
No.
Okay, how long did it take you?
10 years.
10 years. Okay, next slide. For the average person who can get on this path, and again, most people can't get on it, it's 5 to 15 years from an alien to a citizen. And for many people today, it's actually even longer. But this path is not open to most of the world. Most people can't get on it. Most people instead face the next slide. Okay, now, you don't have to read this. This is just for visual shock effect, okay? This is a diagram or a flow chart that was done by Reason magazine a few years ago. And they were trying to counter the people that say, oh, there's this easy path to citizenship. And so they flow charted out how to get a green card. This doesn't even tell you how to get citizenship. It tells you how to get a green card. And they see all those red things there? That's sorry, you don't qualify. Okay? So this is the mess. This is the mess that most people face if they're trying to immigrate legally to the United States. This unbelievably complicated flowchart, which has all these stop signs that say, sorry, you don't qualify. After you've followed the flowchart for a while and probably paid a lawyer a lot of money and tried to do everything the right way and so forth, you get to a stop sign and you're told you're not going to qualify. And there's nothing open to you. And you feel very discouraged. And you think, well, what about Canada? You know? They have a more logical immigration system. And yes, they do. And you start thinking about other parts of the world because it is really, really, really difficult. Okay, next slide. This is the waiting list by category. Again, you just eyeball this and you see how horrible it is. These are the different quotas for immigrant visas that are out there in the world and how long it takes people to get them. And you'll see in the family fourth preference category, which is at the bottom on the left, there's 2.5 million people waiting to immigrate based on a brother or sister who's a U.S. citizen who's filed papers for them. And most of those people are going to wait 15, 20 years before they come to America after somebody filed for them. And on the right, we've got the employment-based categories. And of course, there's quotas for all these. Congress hasn't changed the quotas in decades. We have a country of 320 million people. We have a random quota for immigrant visas. 140,000 employment-based green cards every year. That's it, for 320 million population. That's just a drop in the bucket. And that's why we have such long, long, complicated lines for legal immigration. Next slide. So as a result of this all, we have a great deal of dysfunction and difficulty. And I like this quote. It comes from a doctor who was trying to do everything right. And he had applied for all the visas he was eligible to apply for, and he was getting very, very frustrated. And he said, I've been waiting, law-abiding, tax-paying, how long is long enough? He was looking at 8 years just to get a green card. And this is a skilled doctor, and he was in short supply in his particular specialty, and yet he was going to have to wait 8 years just to get a green card. Okay, next slide. So you want to know who's responsible for all this, right? Not Ronald Reagan. Okay, let me take you back to 1986. The reason I have him up here is the last time we did very serious reform of our immigration laws was in 1986, when Ronald Reagan was the President of the United States. And Ronald Reagan was frustrated with two executive legal systems that we had that had been created by Congress. He was frustrated with the tax system, and he was frustrated with the immigration system. And he said the tax system was a mess, and we were a nation of lawbreakers, and the only thing you could do to reform the tax code was rip it out and start over because it made no sense and everybody was breaking the law and Americans were a bunch of tax cheats. And he gave speeches about this, and he finally got a Tax Reform Act through, 1984 Tax Reform Act. Well, he said the same thing about immigration. He said, we're a nation of lawbreakers, everybody's breaking the law, this is ridiculous, nobody's complying with the immigration laws, I need immigration reform. Now, Congress obliged him, but only partially. They gave him something that immigration lawyers like to call the three-legged stool. The stool had 3 legs. The first leg was employers will enforce the immigration laws because people are coming to America for the jobs, and so the way we dry up illegal immigration is we stop people from getting jobs. And the way we're going to stop people from getting jobs is we're going to have employers be agents of the federal government and check everybody's papers. And if every employer faithfully checks papers and turns people away, then people who are unauthorized to be in the United States won't have jobs and they'll go home, right? Okay, so that was one leg of the stool. The second leg of the stool was an amnesty, a very limited amnesty for certain workers who had been here a long time or who worked in agriculture. Very limited, didn't cover everybody. Okay, but that was one leg of the stool. And the third leg was increased border enforcement. So Congress said if we get all these 3 legs of the stool, we'll have a very stable immigration system. It will be wonderful. It will work really well. Now the problem was the 3 legs were not the same length. So the stool is very wobbly from the get-go, from birth. Okay, the amnesty is limited. The border enforcement doesn't get funded. The employer sanctions don't really work too well. And what we end up with is a very wobbly stool. Now, Ronald Reagan wanted 4 legs in the stool. He thought that was going to be more stable. He didn't get the 4th leg. The 4th leg of the stool was supposed to be a future legal immigration system that would allow people to immigrate legally to the United States in the future if they had a job or they wouldn't have to wait too long to immigrate legally. He begged for that. He didn't get it. Congress only gave him 3 wobbly legs of a stool. So are you surprised that we're in the mess that we're in today? They were darned from the get-go because we basically designed the system badly from the get-go. And this is Congress's fault. Next slide. They're to blame. Okay, so that's who you blame. Next slide. All right, now the other thing that's happened is since 9/11, we've had a big change organizationally. We no longer have one main agency that's in charge of immigration. As you click through this, they're all going to pop up, so you can go until you get to the end there. Okay, so we abolished the Immigration and Naturalization Service. This is a surprise to many people who think it still exists. Don't say INS anymore. It doesn't exist. We abolished them, we created the Department of Homeland Security, and we split up the immigration function amongst 3 separate agencies. This has created huge problems today because they now disagree on the same legal matters. So if you're a good lawyer, you have to figure out whether your client is in front of ICE or USCIS or CBP because the answer is different depending on what agency they're standing in front of. And the agencies disagree. So we got 3 other agencies, and then we have a whole bunch of other agencies involved in immigration. We have Social Security, we have the Department of Justice, we have Department of Labor, Department of State, and even the Internal Revenue Service is involved in immigration today. This is not a reasonable way to run federal function, to have it split up amongst multiple cabinet agencies that all have different rules. It makes it very, very difficult for people to understand the law. Next slide. Now we do know that it creates funny cartoons for people. This is a good one that says, thanks to bureaucratic infighting, it's taken months longer than anticipated, but we finally come up with the parking chart. Okay, guys, next slide. Now the reality is, as I said before, is that most people come to the United States without permission because they have family here or because they want jobs. And so there's another joke about this, that all we have to do, we don't need a border fence with Mexico, we just need the economic charts. Okay, so if we tank our economy, we won't have an unauthorized immigration problem. Has anyone noticed that this works? North Korea does not have an unauthorized immigration problem. Not coming in. Okay, going out, yes. Okay, but because there's no jobs, there's no food, there's no economy. That's a good solution for us, right? Just get rid of all the jobs and the families, and nobody will come, right? Okay, not very realistic. All right, next slide. Okay, so here we have the folks in charge today. Janet Napolitano I put up there because she's responsible for a lot of the policies that are in effect today. And then of course we have Jay Johnson on the right looking very grim, and I still have not seen him smile since he took over as Secretary of Homeland Security. I'm waiting, but I haven't seen him smile. Okay. So these folks are in charge today, and they're facing that system I just described to you. Incredible, complex legal system, very difficult for people to understand. In fact, immigration lawyers rightly joke, although it's true, that even the United States Supreme Court doesn't understand immigration law. There's a blog out there where a Boston College law professor notes every time a federal judge or the Supreme Court makes a mistake with immigration law, and she's got a lot of entries in her blog. It's called Raise Your Hand If You Understand Immigration Law. She points out all the legal decisions of the courts that are just wrong, where they don't understand immigration. Okay, so here's who we have in charge today. And what have they been doing to solve this problem? Well, Barack Obama, of course, when he was running for political office and when he got elected the second time, made a lot of promises about immigration. This is one of the first ones that he was repeatedly making. He said, I'm confident we'll get done next year, immigration reform. This was in 2012. What year are we? Do we have it yet? I will just be very blunt. Should I win a second term? A big reason I will win a second term is because the Republican nominee and the Republican Party have so alienated the fastest growing demographic group in this country, the Latino community. And this is a relatively new phenomenon. George Bush and Karl Rove were smart enough to understand the changing nature of America. And so I'm fairly confident that they're going to have a deep interest in getting this done. And I want to get it done because it's the right thing to do, and I've cared about this. Now, the key takeaway from this, when we're talking about the future of immigration law, is something he pointed out that's absolutely true. The growing demographic power of the Latino and the Hispanic community. And we'll get back to that in a minute, but I'm a little positive about the future because I see that demographic as being absolutely decisive. And that's a demographic that applauds people who are in favor of immigration reform. They see the reality every day visited upon their families of bad immigration laws, and they want them changed. They want law to return to reason, free from passion. Next slide. Okay, now, That was the president's promise. What we've gotten are things like the H-1B cap filling up rather quickly. This year, 250,000 people applying for 885,000 H-1B visas. A lot of unhappy people didn't get visas in the lottery, okay? So that's not a good thing. Next slide. Professional worker visa. Yeah, sorry. And that impacts Massachusetts a lot, because there's a lot of folks in Massachusetts who are trying to get these visas and we're told, sorry, you can't get them. Okay, next slide. We've gotten massive employer enforcement going on. This is happening in your area. The administration has figured out that long ago Ronald Reagan tasked every employer in America with being an immigration agent. And Congress has improved the powers of the federal government to the point where every time you make a mistake as an agent of the federal government, on that infamous I-9 form that every employee has to fill out on the first day of work, the government can fine you. And it's a strict liability offense. It doesn't matter if you didn't mean to make a mistake. It doesn't matter if your mistake was silly. It doesn't matter if none of your workers are unauthorized to be in the United States. The government can fine you, and they can increase the federal trough substantially by going in and inspecting your forms, $100 for every mistake. Free piece of legal advice tonight if you're a small business owner. Check page 2 and make sure the names of your employees are on page 2. Okay. Because you get a $100 fine for not putting their name on page 2. So the administration has gone crazy fining people and conducting I-9 audits. And this is not something that people notice, but it's having a big impact across the country. Next slide. Barack Obama also promised he was going to slow down deportations. Okay, all right. And I know there's some experts in the audience who are skeptical and immediately, okay. He said deportations went up because Congress put a whole lot of money into it, and we have a lot of resources, a lot more agents involved, they're going to be higher numbers. I've said is let's make sure you're not misdirecting these resources, but we're still going to ultimately have to change the laws in order to avoid some of the heartbreaking stories. And that's why this continues to be a top priority of mine. Okay, next slide. As you all know, Barack Obama gets called the deporter-in-chief for a reason. Okay, his numbers are skyrocketed on deportations. And I'm an immigration lawyer, so I can tell you they're not all priority 1, priority 2. A lot of the folks who are getting rounded up and deported are very low priority, supposedly. People with families, people who lived in the country a really long time, Central American refugees with valid claims for asylum. But the agency has been told, and I think the theory here was, if we make people feel the pain, then Congress will enact immigration reform. And so we're going to enforce the laws to the hilt, and that way we'll get some immigration reform. Now that proved not to be true, but that was the theory behind this massive amount of enforcement. Next slide. And of course we have a lot of mistakes when you have that kind of enforcement. I've seen this kind of thing myself because as an attorney I've handled a lot of cases where somebody was an American citizen and didn't know it, or was an American citizen and was being deported. So this slide depicts one individual. He's a brother of a U.S. Army soldier. He was born in the United States of America, and yet he was deported to Mexico by the U.S. government. Native-born American citizen. It's because he was mentally disturbed, and the agents came into his jail cell and said, sign here, and he agreed with them that his name was some Mexican name, even though it wasn't. His name was Mark Little. And so they deported him to Mexico, and the Mexicans said, well, you're obviously not Mexican. And so the Mexicans sent him along to another country, and he ended up in Central America. He found a U.S. consulate or embassy in Central America that took pity on him, and his family was frantic at this point, looking for him, including his Army soldier brother. So they found him in Central America. They faxed all the paperwork to the consulate. The consulate gave him a temporary passport to come back to the United States. He got on a plane, got to Atlanta, Georgia, and the immigration agent said, hey, you're that Mexican guy we deported. So we're going to deport you again because you're trying to stay back with this fake U.S. citizen passport. Okay? So these are the kind of stories that, I hear them every day. I think the public doesn't hear them very often, but with this massive increase in deportations have also come a massive increase in deportations of military veterans, of U.S. citizens. Because if you're going to round people up and you have an imperfect process, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. And this is just one of them. Next slide. Okay, President Obama also promised he was going to get the DREAM Act passed. I mentioned the Dreamers before. I think this is a wonderful bill. It's something I've supported for more than 10 years. I've been testifying on Capitol Hill for more than 10 years about the merits of this bill. But it makes absolutely no sense to me from a national security perspective that we should take young people who've grown up in America, who've been educated here, who are, turning 18 and about to enter our workforce and pay back our taxpayers for all the money we've spent educating them. It makes no sense to export them to a foreign country where they haven't lived since they were small. And it doesn't make sense from a national security perspective. Why would you want to deport somebody who's a US educated rocket scientist to Venezuela? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense to us. Why don't we want these future workers, these taxpayers, now that they've been educated and they can enter our workforce? So I wouldn't blame President Obama for not passing the DREAM Act. He did, of course, do DACA. How many people in the audience know what DACA is? Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This was an executive action in 2012 under Janet Napolitano. It said that if you had been in the United States for a long time, more than 5 years, and you were a young person who had graduated from high school here or had attended college, and you were of good moral character, the government was going to defer your deportation temporarily. And the government would give you a work permit for 2 years so you could work temporarily. Again, they said you were deportable. You were going to have to come forward, have your fingerprints taken, prove that you're a good moral character, but they were going to temporarily give you permission to work in the United States for a couple of years. And the idea was, well, if we do that, people will see how much these young people are contributing to our society, and maybe they'll pass the DREAM Act. Because Congress has tried a couple of times to pass it, and they almost passed it one time, but they just couldn't bring themselves to do it. So maybe they'll pass it, because it's technically a bipartisan bill, and the thinking was it makes sense for America. There's actually not too many people with logical arguments against it. So the idea was maybe it'll pass eventually if we show what these young people can contribute. But so far that hasn't happened, and that has not happened yet. Next slide. And the net result of all this, of course, is this cartoon, I think, aptly depicts it. Immigration policy, it's a border that hasn't been crossed in years. And you've got Uncle Sam there saying, nope, too hard. It's just too hard for our political leaders to get this problem solved that everybody knows is a problem. Okay, next slide. So what's the future of immigration reform? It's with Congress. There's limited things that the president can do, and I'll mention some of them a little bit later, but the president's at the point where probably he's done more or less. There are a few things he could do still on his own, but he's probably going to have to get Congress to act in order to fix this problem. Now, I am hopeful that Congress will act eventually, because I see the rising tide of the demographics, and we just don't have a choice, folks. We really don't. We cannot afford to have a broken immigration system much longer. It's hurting our national economy, it's hurting our national security. And the demographics are against us, so let's get to that. Next slide. Oh, before I talk about that, though, I do want to mention the Gang of Eight. How many of you know about the Gang of Eight? Okay, they tried to get immigration reform passed a couple of years ago, and you'll see the Gang of Eight in the Senate up there. You'll see the famous faces. 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats trying to join together to be leaders for the country. Most people don't understand the huge bill that they passed through the Senate. And most immigration lawyers had a hard time with it too. It didn't make things easier. It was excessively complicated. It was not the simple solution to our immigration problems. But it was not an amnesty. And it got tarred and feathered as an amnesty. And I want to quickly, because I have a little bit of time, give you the 2-minute version of this bill so that you understand what was in it. And you can go back and tell your friends and neighbors what was actually in this bill. Okay, so next slide, there's a video. You're going to have to try to get the video to start.
Opponents of increased immigration say the main bill being debated in Congress is nothing more than amnesty, a free pass for unauthorized workers. The real implications of the bill are far more complex. An immigrant in this country illegally can qualify for registered provisional immigrant status, a work permit, if he was in the country prior to 2012, pays any and all outstanding tax bills, goes through national security and background checks, and pays a $1,000 fine and a $500 fee. Only then will he get a work permit, which is valid for just 6 years. But if an immigrant wants to continue working in the United States after that, he'll have to apply for a new permit and pay another $500 fee, prove that he's been employed during the entire 6-year period at no less than the federal poverty line, and prove he's paid all necessary taxes. That permit is good for just 4 years. After that, an immigrant can apply for a green card right after he proves he can speak English, proves he hasn't been on welfare, passes another round of security and background checks, and pays all the normal fees associated with a green card. And he'll only get that green card if the federal government has met all of its various immigration enforcement goals. Does that sound like a free pass to you? Learn more about our broken immigration system at cato.org.
Okay, so that video was made by the Cato Institute. It's a libertarian institute that likes good immigration, sensible immigration laws, I think, and they're dead on their description of the Senate bill. No way was it an easy amnesty for anybody. In fact, it was probably going to be full employment for immigration lawyers, because most people, to get through that path, are going to have to be close friends with an immigration lawyer, probably for 10 or 15 years in order to meet the requirements of the law. You saw that flowchart earlier. When lawyers started flowcharting out this process, it looked just as bad as that flowchart that I gave you. Okay, so this was the bill that the Senate passed. It was derided as being an amnesty for unauthorized immigrants, and of course it didn't pass. It failed to pass. I think, though, one of the things that troubles me is that Congress, when they talk about immigration reform, they always talk about really complicated, convoluted laws that are going to be really hard for people to qualify for and are going to take a really long time to implement and get forth. And very few people will fall out at the other end, and that's one of my concerns. I think the American public would be better served with a lot simpler immigration laws. If you do the polls, most people think that people who've lived in the country for a really long time and have paid their taxes and aren't criminals and have learned English and so forth, those folks should get a green card. That's what the polls say when you ask the public. I don't think people have this convoluted pathway in mind, but that's what folks deride as an amnesty for unauthorized immigrants, this 10 to 15-year path to citizenship. Okay, and of course we have John Boehner here because he's been one of the outspoken opponents of some of these reforms. Next slide. Okay, so the future of immigration reform. I do think eventually America is going to pass some version of the DREAM Act. Now, we've seen a little bit of progress on this. The program that I came up with, the MAVNI program that I mentioned earlier, recently was opened to the folks with DACA status. So they are now allowed, if they qualify, to enlist in the military, and they can earn their citizenship at basic training through military service. Unfortunately, the program that I designed was not designed for people with deferred action for childhood arrivals, and it's actually designed to weed them out. So far we've only had about 110 people who've been able to qualify for the program because the rules are really strict and complicated and it wasn't designed for DACAs. I was hoping the president would have a separate recruiting program for them because the military actually needs these individuals, but they chose not to do that. They chose to put them into the MAVNI program, which most of them can't qualify for. But I do think, however, eventually we're going to get the DREAM Act. Next slide. Okay, now the president did also try something we call expanded DACA, expanded deferred action for childhood arrivals. And he also tried something called deferred action for parental accountability. Now again, deferred action just means we could deport you, but we've decided to defer your deportation. It doesn't mean you get a green card. It doesn't mean you get citizenship. It just means we have decided to defer your deportation temporarily. And because we don't want you to be getting public aid, public benefits, we're going to make you work while we defer your deportation. So we give you a temporary work permit so that you can support yourself while we're deferring your deportation. The president proposed this for young people, and he wanted expanded DACA. He was going to change the age limit so that people who had come to the United States when they were kids but had aged out of the 2012 program were going to be allowed into this new expanded program. And then he had a program where he was going to defer the deportation of parents of U.S. citizens and parents of kids who had green cards. So if you had a child who was a U.S. citizen, instead of getting deported, which is the current policy, if you get picked up by immigration today and you have a 2-year-old child who's an American citizen, you're deported. You know, people don't realize that. And most of these parents had been taking their American citizen kids with them, or they had been abandoning them in the United States, depending on what country they were getting deported to. Because if you're a parent and you have a small child, and your child was born in America and is an American citizen, you have a tough choice if you're getting deported to some countries around the world. Your child might not have much of a life in the country that you're getting deported to. And so some parents have chosen to leave their kids behind in the United States with relatives or friends. Others have taken their kids with them, which has created a different phenomenon. A phenomenon of American citizens being brought up in foreign countries with no background, no education in America. When they turn 18, they come back to the United States to claim their birthright, but they haven't learned our culture, they haven't learned about our politics, they haven't learned about being an American. And so that's a problem too. So what the president proposed was something called deferred action for parental accountability, which would defer the deportation of parents of U.S. citizens, but only if they didn't have criminal records, they weren't a threat to national security, they'd been here a really long time, and so forth and so on, they're paying their taxes. So it was very limited, and they were just going to get a temporary work permit. This program, both of these programs were enjoined by a federal judge in Texas. Next slide. And the injunction's in place today. Now, I'm a lawyer, and I can only give you the 30-minute soundbite on this, but there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the president had authority to do this. Because what he was doing was exercising something we call prosecutorial discretion. He has the authority under the law to defer the deportation of people if he wants to do that. The federal government doesn't have the resources to deport everybody, and they were more or less deporting hundreds of thousands of people randomly. And so what the president said was, we're going to give priority to criminals, felons, drug dealers, and so forth for deportation. And the people who have been behaving themselves, we're going to defer their deportation until later and make them work while they're waiting to be deported some years from now. Okay? And there's absolutely no dispute among experienced lawyers that the president had authority to do this. But there was a judge in Texas who enjoined the president's programs. Next slide. And he said basically that the president hadn't published notice in the Federal Register about this program properly. So that was the main reason why there's an injunction in place today. Unfortunately, most people think at this moment in time that the clock is now running out on the Obama administration, and they just don't have the energy now to fight this, and they're probably not going to do much with it, and we won't see action on deferred action for childhood arrivals expanded, or DAPA, as they call it, until the next president comes into office. So what this leaves us with is immigration as a key issue in the next presidential election. And every candidate is going to be opining about immigration. Next slide. But, and here's where we get to the future again. Today, about 13% of the U.S. population is foreign-born. That is a huge number of people. That's the highest percentage of the U.S. population being foreign-born since the great wave of immigration. It's growing larger. By 2025, it's going to be 15% of the U.S. population. These are just demographics. We're a global society. Americans go overseas, they marry, they bring foreign spouses back, they bring foreign parents back, they bring foreign children back. You know, it's just the facts. We're not going to be able to get around this. We're not going to reduce it. It's just not possible. So this is one of the demographic facts, and it's one of the reasons why we will have reform eventually. And here's the next one. Next slide. This is a demographic picture of the United States, and on the left you have the breakdown by age category of the United States in 1950. And on the right, we have the demographic breakdown by age category in 2050. So we've got 1950 on the left compared with 2050 on the right. And it's broken down by age. You can see at the bottom, the red bar on the left, that's 0 to 5-year-olds in the US population in 1950. And on the right, what's that blue bar? Would anyone in the audience like to tell me? That's you. Okay, that's the over 80 population in 2050. And it's huge. And this is a big demographic challenge for the United States of America. And it's one reason why we're going to have immigration reform, whether we like it or not. Okay, because the picture on the right is not a pretty one. That's a population where we have a lot of folks who are retiring, who don't want to work anymore, who probably don't want to be police officers and soldiers and teachers and so forth, because they want to enjoy their retirement years, right? And they want to collect Social Security, right? And we don't have that many workers. We have a flat population demographic by age group. We're not going to have that baby boom that we had on the left side. The left side, by the way, is the Pentagon dream demographic picture, and the right side is the Pentagon nightmare. The left side is a dream picture because all those young people in the population, they're going to grow up and they're going to enter the workforce, and they're going to be available to go to work for employers, they're going to be available for military service. The right side, there's not enough working age people for all the jobs that we need to fill. We're not going to have enough people for the military. We're not going to have enough people for police jobs and Homeland Security jobs and lawyer jobs and physicist jobs and all the jobs out there that you need strong workers for to fill. We're just not going to have it. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to get immigration reform. It may not be this year, It may not be out until after the next presidential election, but we're going to get it eventually because we can't afford not to. We need to have more young people. We need to have more people in the workforce who can fund the retirement of all of those of us like me who are going to be in that blue bar in 2050. Okay, and so that's why I think and I believe that eventually we're going to get immigration reform. Because if we don't, we're not going to be a superpower anymore. We're not going to have a strong economy. We're just not going to be able to survive in the world. Next slide. National power is made up of three things. We learned this at the Army War College where I studied. Geography, resources, and population. And that last one, population, is the most significant one when you're looking at national security. You really need to have the skilled people, and you need to have the numbers of people that you need to have a strong economy to fund your secure nation and to keep your nation strong. And so we have the geography, we probably have the resources, but population's starting to become a problem. And Bev mentioned earlier the Central American crisis, and I kind of want to close on that because I thought it was definitely a tragedy when women and children were running across the border in great numbers, and we didn't react in a way that I felt showed leadership. You know, we should have looked at these young people and said, you know, hey, they're fleeing violence, they're fleeing conflict in Central America. Central America, by the way, the countries they were fleeing are the countries with the highest death rate in the world. You know, the death rate in those three countries is worse than in war zones in Afghanistan and Iraq right now. And so they're fleeing violence, and what do? We say we want to send them back. Instead of our national leaders saying, you know, step up, we have this long policy towards Central America that somehow has contributed to some of this. This is a really dangerous part of the world. These young people are all fleeing here. This is an opportunity for us. We could welcome them, we could educate them, we could make them part of our workforce eventually. They could become a tremendous asset to us coming at this young age. And instead we said, no, we're just going to send them back, and sending many of them back to their deaths, actually. Quite a tragedy. And I can tell you, I have represented young people. I handled a case for a young woman from El Salvador last summer. And it's critical that these folks get attorneys. Because if they get lawyers, they can win their cases. Most of them have a claim to getting a green card if they have a lawyer helping them. And the young lady I represented was able to get a green card. So she was granted asylum in the United States of America because she was fleeing violence in El Salvador. And has a bright future here in the United States. Next slide. Okay, so I return to the quote I opened with. My dream, my fundamental dream, and what I'm hoping to do with my MacArthur grant is to help return immigration law to the traditional quote of Aristotle, where it no longer is passion free from reason, but it becomes an area of law that is actually reason free from passion. I think that's the best way to contribute to America's national security and to make our immigration system something that we can be proud of, that contributes to our economy, contributes to our national security, and makes us continue to be a superpower. Thank you very much. Anybody have questions? Yes.
First, thank you for an enlightening and terrific presentation. Of the announced and unannounced presidential candidates in the 2016 political sweepstakes, which one do you think is most likely to gather the political will to change the immigration laws?
Yes, the question had to do with the political candidates, and of course I'm speaking in my personal opinion only. I'm not trying to convey any opinions of any government officials or anything like this, but it's been interesting to watch. This is Massachusetts, right? So I have a lot of Democrats here. Admit you're a Democrat. Raise your hand. Okay, all right. How many Republicans? You're hiding. Okay, all right. On the Republican side, Jeb Bush by far is the best on immigration. And I can just tell you that because I worked with him on the Council on Foreign Relations Independent Task Force on U.S. immigration policy. He has a nuanced understanding of the issues. He chaired with Mac McClarty, he chaired the Commission on U.S. immigration policy several years ago. He understands the issues because his wife is an immigrant, and he fully understands what a mess the immigration system is. He also wrote that book I mentioned, Immigration Wars, and he says some things that I don't necessarily agree with in the book, but I think his overall philosophy is coherent and understandable. And he's also, frankly, been quite brave at announcing how he stands on immigration, which is diametrically opposed to every single other Republican candidate right now, as far as I can tell. Okay, so there we go, Jeb Bush. All right. We're going to talk Bernie Sanders here? We're going to talk Hillary? Or okay. Hillary Clinton is interesting because she's a little bit of a cipher. She was the wife of the president who signed the worst immigration law in American history into law in 1996. Little known fact, Bill Clinton is responsible for all those deportations, right? Because he signed actually 2 laws in 1996, the Anti-Death Penalty, Effective Death Penalty Act, and the Immigration Reform Act in 1996, both of which have created this large population of unauthorized immigrants. And people don't realize this. 20th anniversary is next year of IRA, and EDPA. And immigration lawyers are just gritting their teeth because they are, without doubt, the worst immigration laws in U.S. history. So I think what we're all hoping from Hillary is that she will have some people tell her that, and maybe she'll repeal the law her husband signed. You know, first day in office. You know, let's just repeal that, because a lot of our problems, frankly, would be solved if they would simply repeal some of these laws that they have passed. You know, a lot of the unauthorized immigration would just go away overnight if they got rid of some of the silly stuff they put in the 1996 laws. My favorite one is, if you're in the United States unlawfully for more than a year and you leave for any reason, you're banned from coming back for 10 years. That's correct. Okay? If you leave, you've been here unlawfully for more than a year and you leave, you're banned from coming back for 10 years. But not if you don't leave, you're not banned. Okay? Now, you know why we have so much unauthorized immigration? And guess what? They're not leaving. Okay, we had a question in the back.
I have a question about is there any action, executive action, that can be taken to specifically address the Central American issue? You know, Deval Patrick, our governor, when that crisis was occurring, said, you know, they're welcome to come and stay at Andrews. But you know, that didn't happen. I'm just wondering if there's any sort of executive action that President Obama could take that obviates the need for Congress to act. I mean, you've spoken that the pieces that you've gotten passed were all vis-a-vis executive action.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things they could do. One thing which I don't know why they didn't do it was, hey, ask for volunteers, right? You know, we have a woman and child in a detention center. Is there an American family that would like to sponsor them? You know, step up to the plate, you know. I'm sure enough people will come forward. I mean, the numbers aren't actually that great for these folks. And again, we have a country of 320 million people. Do you think there are maybe 40,000 American families that might step forward and say, I'm willing to sponsor somebody? Probably. And you can get out of detention if you have a sponsor who's an appropriate person that's willing to, you know, step forward and help you get integrated into American society. Most of these folks, by the way, can get some kind of legal status if they're out of a detention center and they have access to a nonprofit or to a lawyer that has time to develop their case. One of the problems right now is the lawyers are overwhelmed. You know, you go to these detention centers and you have to take, you know, you're a lawyer in private practice, you're being asked to leave your private practice, go down there for a week, abandon all your clients who are paying you money, you know, basically donate a week of your life, and, you know, it's just too many people that need help. And there just aren't enough lawyers to volunteer to help these cases. But in places like Boston, there's a lot of lawyers who could handle a case if a family was temporarily up here and they could meet with them, you know, for a couple hours a week over a period of several months. I think you would get a lot of people volunteering. I mean, I know I would. I'd take a family, you know, and I know lots of my fellow lawyers would do that too. So that's one thing that I think would have been pretty easy to do. And they used to do that in the old days. You know, when the Cuban kids were coming over, that's what they did. You know, they didn't say round them up, put them in a detention camp, and send them back. You know, let's integrate these kids with American families and see what happens. So they could do that. Other things they could do, they could let the Dreamers enlist in the military and not through the MAVNI program, because that doesn't work for them. A lot of these young people who are DACAs were in junior ROTC in high school, and they were superstars in their junior ROTC program, and they're not allowed to join the military. And the president has the authority to let them join, but he won't exercise it for whatever reason. You know? And they would have a path to citizenship through military service. That's already the law.
We should probably take one more question and then begin to break up, because we have to get out of here by time.
Okay, no problem. Question?
Well, I wondered if you could just clarify, because I don't understand the legal aspects, how a federal district court can stop the expanded DACA with a technicality such as it did.
Well, because federal judges are very powerful, and and the judge issued an injunction. And the injunction has not been overturned. An injunction is an order from a judge saying, don't do that. So the judge issued an injunction, and essentially his argument was they hadn't followed the Administrative Procedures Act because they failed to publish a notice in the Federal Register about these two programs. And it was interesting because they had published one in the 2012 program, but for whatever reason they didn't publish one for these two programs. Yeah, and then the Fifth Circuit took it up and declined to lift the injunction. So in order to get the program going now, they have to win the court case, which takes a while. So they can't go forward with this injunction in place, essentially. So the program's not over, but it's lost its steam.
Do you think Obama's lost his steam?
Well, I kind of get that sense. Yeah. Have any of you seen him lately? No. No. I think everybody's focusing on 2016, right? I mean, they don't think there's any legislation coming down the pipeline, and people are starting to announce they're running for president, and that kind of signals the end to. But I still hold out hope. I mean, once in a while you get a Congress that at the last minute when nobody's watching, they pass some good law, right? So we'll keep our eyes open and hope for the best. It's going to happen, folks, sooner or later. It's just a question of when. If not now, eventually. Okay, one more question before we got to get out of here. Yes, ma'am.
I know there's the focus on who gets elected as the next president, but in the meantime, is there any one thing that comes to your mind that some community groups, like the ones that we have in Needham, could focus on that might make a difference in terms of immigration reform?
Sure. I mean, I think you could pressure the administration severely about the detention centers for the young people. That's something that there's no reason why they had to do that. That was a policy choice that we're going to deter other people from coming by locking up one group of people. And that's a policy choice that should horrify most Americans. That we're going to put people in jail to deter other people. And we're not going to consider the merits of your claim under long-standing international law that we have signed. And it's a numbers thing, right? Okay, so it's basically telling people that asylum law is a numbers thing. It's not based on the law, it's based on how many of you there are claiming asylum. And I've heard that argument before, and it wasn't pretty. It was prior to World War II. We don't want these refugees here because there's too many of them. Okay, so we're going to send them back, and then what happens, right? So I think you could pressure on that. There's a lot of ways you could pressure the administration. I think refugee quotas, increase the quota. Temporary protected status is something the president has statutory authority to impose on any country. He can do that, with a stroke of a pen. So he could declare a certain country eligible for temporary protected status. Now, interestingly, El Salvador is eligible for TPS, but only if you've been here a really long time. Does that make sense? I mean, the conflict down there is still going on. Why don't we change the date on temporary protected status? That's easy to do. So you could pressure the president to change the date on TPS. You could ask him to add countries to the list of countries eligible for TPS, for temporary protected status. Why isn't Nepal on the list? They just had a big earthquake, right? Traditionally, TPS. No, they're pressuring for it, but it hasn't happened yet. Unless it happened today and I wasn't paying attention. No. Somalia got renewed, but not Nepal yet. But, they could do that. So they could issue TPS orders for specific countries quite easily.
Expand Haiti.
Yep. Well, there's a lot of things that could be done that aren't happening. So you could pressure on refugee quotas, expansion of TPS. Women and children in detention centers, not acceptable, Especially if they have a sponsor, they could be released into the community, and then they would have a chance to develop their cases in a way that comports with law. Okay.
We are
We're
very... This has been really wonderful and very enlightening in terms of the scope of it, to be able to understand what we're working on.
Well, thank you all for being here and not running off.